of odd predicament, and the original filming of that, a little more detail at some point about your relationship with Roger Sandall and perhaps with some of the characters in the film. And but predominantly what we want to talk about is, sorry, this one. Ave. Ha. No. You don't think that's pretty?
No, I think it's okay.
No, you do it. You do it. Really, I want you to make it good. You're better.
I mean, you might hate it though, but if you hate it, you can always change it back, right?
No, I'm not gonna hate it.
You just want me to do what I think would look good?
I want you to do exactly what you think.
Okay. My bad. Sorry.
It's okay.
I thought I was holding it up.
It's fine. Just give me a heads up before you do anything like that, okay?
Sorry.
It's okay.
Papa, I'm gonna move you a little bit if that's
Sure.
okay.
Yeah.
Just go ahead and stand up for me. So I can
Sure,
move your
sure,
chair a little.
sure.
Alright, try sitting back down there.
Okay. Hello? Yeah, where are you, Nasir? The people in the airport can't find you. She's in Delhi. That's what I thought she was, because my guy just called that she's not on the plane. What's the flight number of the new flight that she's coming in on?
Tell me what you think about this. This is just, I mean, you may not like it at all, but I think that with more of the background,
I'll check that. My guys checked that the next flight in from Delhi on Air India comes in at about 8:15 in the evening, but I'll check that they may have got it wrong. 5:30. If you talk to Nasir, if he can know the flight number and whether it is Air India or she's being moved to another airline, because sometimes that happens. If they know airline. Because I mean, she may be flying. Yeah, if she communicates with you, and one way to do it also is maybe send her an email, because she may have access to email at the airport. And she can send me she can go to a telephone booth in the airport and call me using dollars to make a phone call. Or call you. That may be easier, because anyway, if we need to know when she's coming and what flight she's coming, because it may not be the Air India flight, it may be the next flight the Air India could put her on. So I'll keep a watch on both those timings. One is 5:15 and the other one is 8:15, or 5:30 and 8:15. So okay, but I don't think there's an Air India flight at that time, but I'll check, because my guy just called me to say the next flight from Delhi comes at 8:15, and so it may be that she's then flying in on Kingfisher or Indian Airlines or some other flight that she can do. Hang on, there's an incoming call. Maybe she's calling me. Hang on. No, it's my guys calling from the airport. So okay, Valerie, We'll keep this, is going to have a happy ending, don't worry. Even if she goes around the world 3 times, she's going to end up here. Take care. Oh, come on. Sorry. The shotgun mic's going over my head, yeah. Oh, a little more tilt down.
I think it's okay. It's a cardioid.
No, it's not. It's a shotgun.
Well, but it's called the super cardioid
Okay.
shotgun.
Okay, all right.
It sounds okay to me.
Okay, good.
This is a real mic.
Okay, great. That's even better. So it's tested, right? We can ask the question. We can begin.
Yeah. My question, first question is, I would just like you to speak to the traditional role of Rajputs in general, and your clan in particular, in managing the relationships between various food-producing entities in their kingdoms, and whether there was a conscious effort or not to maintain a kind of sustainable agricultural balance.
Yeah. Well, in Saurashtra, in the peninsula of Gujarat, that's is located at the extremity of Western India, we have a particularized ecological environment. This environment it used to be an island before it was joined in prehistoric times to the Indian mainland, and that particular isolation, which was slowly eroded by the riverine forces that joined the island, called for a mixed economy and a periodic and seasonal economy. Now this economy was seasonal not merely on an annual basis over the last 1,000 years, which is our area of our particular concern, where the particular social conformations and configurations are taken place and which we inherit, but are preceded by long swatches of reversals between pastoralism as a dominant mode of human enterprise in the peninsula and the agrarian enterprise. So the unilinear motion of the agrarian enterprise succeeding and subordinating the pastoral enterprise is not historically accurate for this region. So when climate changed, the pasture land in fact reverted and it was easier to do agriculture. And when drought prevailed, then what were once favorable lands for agriculture reverted back to scrub and pasture land. So essentially there are 3 forces of economic activity over this particular sub-district of Jhalawar, where we are in fact talking, which is the 2 forms, agrarian and pastoralism. Pastoralism is contained by cattle who are have a particular strategy with grazing, and goats and camels exploit another part of the environment. They are shrub and tree consumers, and sheep and cattle are grass consumers. So even within this particular environment, it's an ecology that suggests that you can have interdependence and coexistence of competing herbivores, domesticated herbivores, and different castes or different clans of different castes, the Rabari, the Bharwar, the Ahir, the Meher, the Charan. These have been the persons who have access and have expertise. One of the most important aspects of this pastoralism strategy is a degree of opportunism that high mobility provides for this enterprise. If conditions are unfavorable, you get up and go to where they're favorable. And that harkens to the old patterns that we see in the Middle East and in Central Asia. Highly mobile, large movements of populations of herbivores can in fact go back and forth. Now, besides that particular factor, we have a additional little known agrarian enterprise, which is the salt making. Every year, because what was once a sea is now a desert salt pan, every year about May, June, the Arabian Sea rises, and with the rise of the Arabian Sea, it will swamp over 1,000 square miles to form a kind of shallow lake about a waist deep. And that highly saline water will in time, by sometime in November, December, depending on the extent of the rainfall, two waters will mix, Arabian Sea waters and the waters of the mountains in the north. They will commingle, so you have a particular ecological formation of brackish, saltish water. This, when the water vanishes, evaporates, goes not deep, but like 40 feet under the surface. And that then, from historic times, about the 10th century, at least, of which my family has had access here, this has been a capital revenue for dominant states. Whatever the dominant power was in Gujarat would like to have taxation over salt. And what this in fact did was, you now had a third component, a third leg of the tripod: pastoralism and agrarianism, and then this kind of surface mining or farming of salt. And these three components were interdependent. That's what gave this particular region its economic character, and the people who marshal the economic resources of this environment are three. Now, in our film, we are dealing primarily with the agrarian and the pastoralist enterprise. But we can't forget that in the immediate vicinity is this third component. So this idea of, it's not just A against B or pastoralism versus, it's far more complex. And the nuanced relationship between pastoral groups, farming groups, and mining groups are in fact what the dominant ruling groups control. What they do, of course, is to control and give access to economic opportunity, cementing certain privileges and rights to mining populations, farming populations, and pastoral populations. These rights are determined by the relationships of dependence that the dominant group establishes. Revenue in certain cases and military support in the others. So for instance, when it comes to the agrarian or the salt makers, they are essentially a revenue producing unit. But when it comes to pastoralism, the pastoralist components in times past have also provided military subsidiary service to what was otherwise a unitary administrations that were tied on agrarian control, and that seems to have been the pattern. So whereas the Rajputs, which are the kind of warrior caste, maybe the dominant military component, they don't work in isolation. They work with other castes supporting them in various ways. And obviously the relationship in earlier times, almost all these small kingdoms had points of retreat. Comes the big invading force, whether that's the Turkish Sultanate dynasties or the Mughal dynasties after them, or the Marathas from the south, or even the British colonials. There are pockets of retreat within the boundaries of the kingdom, untamed areas where you could then retreat to and then through guerrilla warfare return, which is how they are able to retain their military and physical presence, which leads to the fact of a peculiar phenomenon, which they're very proud of here. It happens in many harsh environments, whether it's the Scottish Highlands or the Himalayan kingdoms. The areas where there isn't that much economic immediate reward for conquering dynasties. They want subordination, not conquest, because most dominant kingdoms or empires are in the business of consolidating revenue. So farmlands are always the heartlands to which succeeding dynasties go. And so as far as these guys are concerned, in peripheral regions, harsh regions, they simply have to wait it out. The long guerrilla wars lead finally to the decline of central governments. They are then replaced by others. And the very fact that there's a rotation of paramountcy, so the center is weak in this instance and the periphery is strong. Very unlike agrarian, Chinese, Egyptian, Indic in terms of Doab, where the central systems are much more based on agrarian and the control of agrarian water systems and farming systems, which then call for the attraction of large labor, and that then leads to large revenue and specialization into guilds of merchant classes, artisan classes, craftsmen classes, intellectual classes, aesthetic classes. All of that kind of cements itself where there is surplus, where you can then have higher levels of specialization. So I think that in some sense gives us a sense of how a peripheral society like this one continues to have identity and continues to be able to resist forces of co-optation. Subordination they see periodically, but they see that as a transitional device. This guy is strong right now, we bend our knee and pay the tribute. He's weak, we withhold the tribute and reassert our independence. And that essentially is the dance between peripheral Rajput kingdoms in this area. And they're not only Rajput. In this peninsula we have Muslim kingdoms, African kingdoms, even mercantile kingdoms, as well as various Rajput kingdoms. The dominant ruling group for the last 1,000 years has been these Rajput clans. But that's by no means to suggest that they are the only exclusive exercisers of political authority. Alongside that, there's then mercantile authority vested in the port cities of the empire, in Surat, in Bharuch, and other ports in Mandvi, in Kutch. And these enterprises are non-territorial, whereas the Rajput agrarian enterprises are territorial. These are networks, so that in fact a business family will have one unit in Surat, another one in Aden, the third one in Zanzibar, the fourth one in Muscat. So this way, all the way to Rome and the middle Mediterranean and east to Indonesia and China, there's a whole kind of network of economic enterprise. And this economic enterprise gives them very easy ability to shift money to centers of power. And very often these more landed estates need capital to fight off something, drought, whatever, or aggrandizement, and they become beholden to economic forces of the mercantile groups. And so there are many an instance where the economic power of these particular principalities that are merchant princes, like in Ahmedabad, in Surat, in Cambay, in Muscat, in Zanzibar, are very much coexistent. Yes, they're not kings, but they are people and elements that can control kings. And this has been since Roman times. For most of the time until the Portuguese took over the Arabian Sea, it was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And even port cities or islands just off the coast were controlled by the Ottoman Turks. So this idea of vested locales, and in all of this, up in the present time, cattle and sheep and goat are shipped as an economic unit on the hoof in local boats and now bigger boats to ports of the Middle East, where they're slaughtered for food. So this ancient enterprise hasn't changed. It's just that it now has new mechanisms of sustaining it. So this notion of isolation and interdependency is very important. This interdependency, which is not visible when you go into the village, or you think these guys in the back are beyond and there's no connections. That's because we see them in the isolate. Maybe the fact of language sustains that, and maybe the idea that certain people in certain groups are in fact local. The ones that are most regional and most localized are obviously agrarian groups and landholding groups. The pastoralist groups, any pastoralist group coming from Kutch going to Gujarat will speak 4 languages because they're navigating through 4 linguistic zones. And so, yes, their home villages may be in Drangadra territory, but their grazing lands over the seasons are across different places. So obviously there are both loyalties and fictive loyalties to more than one locale. And this is very important. There's kind of a interdependency that is also opportunistic. They are also the harbinger of news. They also tell you where wealth lies, because if there has been a heavy crop, that's where you want to go and raid and bring the crop home. So this notion of feuding, which was a feuding cattle keeping culture, that's what informs the Rajput enterprise. And that's why in the Bharwad Predicament first film, they're singing about Rajputs, when they themselves are not Rajput. And they're talking about the Rajput lands where their cattle graze, and they say, oh, in my so vast are our grazing lands that my calf is in one district where the mother is in 3 districts to the right, suggesting the size of the grazing territory and also size of their ability to harvest that. That's their territory. And this is very important. And it's not done by any written constitution, it's done by practice and sustained by things like song and story and episode, and then cherished by storytellings that are done at seasonal gatherings, weddings, religious events. So that's how, in fact, it is. And I think to think of these as localized populations, because that's how we find them and we film them, would be to, in fact, do ourselves and them injustice, because they're much more fluid, they're much more nuanced, they're much more hybrid. And this hybridity, which we have now recognized in anthropology over the last 30 years, is an ancient one. But sometimes we ourselves come to understandings and recognitions much after the fact of theorizing things often happens much later than the actual practice. So I think this is one question that we must mull over. This is kind of a generic question we may wish to ponder. It can be useful not necessarily as speech act in a film, but as a kind of grounding mechanism to see how to place this in what information you want to use from this utterance in structuring the film that will result.
Do you think there was consultation between pastoralists and Rajputs about, for example, things as intricate as herd sizes, ratios of cattle to sheep to goats, or was this something that was managed internally by response to the environment and Rajputs themselves adjusted to what the Bharwad were doing? What I'm getting at here is, after independence, there's been 2 primary mechanisms for controlling land. One is the free market, and the other is new political institutions, bureaucracies, forestry management, agricultural management teams, and an increasing bureaucratization may or may not be functioning well. And you, as someone who has received both oral and written traditions from your families and were enculturated into an environment of concern for constituencies, you could perhaps speak to the contrast between, you just spoke about how things haven't changed, but are there ways that things may have changed?
Yeah, let me talk to that, and I'll just talk about this idea of Rajput identity in a agrarian and pastoral economy is often articulated by the fact of Rajput heroes dying to bring the cattle home. So one of the ways that wealth could be transferred from one region to the other was on foot, cattle. And so when they were dying, they were dying for the village herds, they were dying for the pastoralist herds. And that was very important to allow them to have legitimacy of rule. And so many stories exist about Rajputs going off and dying to bring the village cattle home, Parvar cattle home, the temple cattle home, all this kind of stuff. This business of when the states went, one of the things that the new democratic states wished to have is settlement. They wanted people to be resident and settled. They didn't want populations to cross over from Gujarat to Rajasthan or Rajasthan to Maharashtra. And there's very good reason for that. You know, if you're going to be an electorate, you want stable populations. You don't want fluid populations going across. How are you going to establish? And there was also the notion that because there was a replacement of systems and there was a celebration of the need for agriculture, all the laws propounded, this is not only in independence, but even, say, from the turn of the 19th century, early 20th century, local kings and rulers were in the business of trying to settle with the British bayonet, establishing a Pax Britannica. The idea of resident military forces was not quite so necessary. So then exploitation of these so-called retreat lands or bad lands, or lands from which you could bounce back as havens where you couldn't be chased, were now open for exploitation. And so these ruling groups invited farmers from Rajasthan and Maharashtra, especially the Kanbi, to come settle because they were known to be good agriculturalists. Pretty much you might make similar kinds of things happening with white Western enterprise in the western states of America. The plow was seen as a way to colonize that land, bring it under subordination, make it productive. The earlier notion of productive safety in forest country or uninhabited country had lapsed because there was no need for military. And this was very important. So as these laws became, the pastoralists became more and more marginalized. Then with partition, another hammer blow came to them because right just to the north of us is the Indus River. And so a lot of the pastoral groups took their flocks to the Indus. Now with the international boundaries separating Pakistan and India, the flow patterns had to go all the way south to the rivers of Narbada and Tapti to the south of Gujarat. So they were flexible, so they could do it because pastoralism is inherently flexible. But huge chunks of populations were now moving in. Normal pasture lands were close to them. And so that was then restricted. Once that happened, then as we saw in the Parvar predicament film, other forms of exploitation went. So there was always mining, so stone mining, so the pasture lands were given up. And mining began and development began. So one would have thought that in the film in the 1980s, we were seeing the end of pastoralist lifestyle and the unequivocal rise of the agrarian enterprise. The agrarian enterprise itself was changing from a opportunistic cropping pattern which said, what crops you can get from rain, and very small plots of land even in that time which were from agriculture, small well gardens, to now new forms of new crops that could take more water if you were next to check dams like sugarcane, and new crops with the coming of the canals. Entirely new patterns and new economies of scale are now in place. Cotton, but now jeera, I'm not sure, cumin, which could never grow. When I was a young boy and I rode across Rangadhar to Jodhpur in the 1960s, there was no cumin grown in this district. It was grown in North Gujarat, and it's a highly paying crop and a highly fragile crop. But now you go all over Jhalawar, the people are growing cumin. And of course with the fact of the canals coming in the last 15 years, areas that were now only sustained in certain kinds of cropping patterns are now open, entirely new crops. And with it also comes a new form of enterprise. The farmers have remained farmers, but a lot of the pastoralists have also taken to farming and are now, so the fact of the easy divide between I'm a farmer and I do something different from you has changed. So often there is splits within the pastoralist community. The elder brother may have land, the younger brother is still herding cattle. So there may be friction within the family about the exploitation of resources and alliances with former can't be opponents saying how should we handle this particular enterprise. Now in that situation, the one I'm kind of exploiting, maybe all over Gujarat and all over North India and all over India itself, the farming enterprise is perhaps gaining ascendancy. However, one then has to ask the question, what the hell happened to Krishnanagar? Because in '83 we saw the rise of the farming community in a desert land and the subordination of the pastoralists. But we come now 30 years later and all that farming land's gone. And so a new factors come in, and that is the fact of the state inserting a new component which was part of the old protective mechanism, now for another notion, now for social and emotional capital of responsibility to the environment and ecology by the protection of wildlife. So this whole desert, which is now declared to be a wildlife refuge, is the largest such national refuge in all the country. And therefore, poor Krishnanagar, which was seen as a government-backed subsidizing enterprise, has found itself right up smack against the enterprise of saying, no, wild asses count. They're not wild asses, flamingos. All of them don't have necessarily economic capital, but they have social and world capital, suggesting we are a responsible, ecologically minded state. So the very forces that aided which was the state aiding the farmers to go into the desert fringe, are now saying, you can't fence your fields. You can't protect your fields from the natural marauders that you were shooting and driving off earlier. There's yet another component. With that happening and the rise of commercial the agro business in Gujarat, there's consortiums of businessmen sitting in Ahmedabad and Mumbai and Chicago and Boston of Indian descent who are buying up huge chunks of land, huge district lands, and because they can't operate unless it's 5,000 acres, when the allowable land is 54 acres unirrigated land for a person. You leapfrog that by saying we are not a farming family, we are an agricultural enterprise. So now that is another very invisible form of external invading force, this time not with the bullet or the spear, but with capital. And right now they're just acquiring these lands, they're not actually on the land. So maybe this transitional period where the wild ass is going to get its own and the antelope, maybe a transitional phase too, before the heavy hitting industrialists come and put their windmills, those things, and the solar panels, and then start doing hydroponic tomatoes for the Californian market or the Bombay market. Now the markets are so huge, and the Indian economic enterprise as well as the Chinese so vibrant that we have now a middle class that's like 640 million. That's twice the population of the United States. So as these guys have more economic capacity, they want more of what was once seasonal, and so then they will pay for it. They are not interested in the same environmental, localized institutions. So it's very possible that the regionalization that these particular regions have so striven to maintain independence will finally bite the dust, not because they couldn't resist the drought, the famine, the spear, and religious iconoclasm, but maybe it'll be the surreptitious honey that comes from global business enterprise. This is very, very important for us to see, because in Jhalawad, in this particular region, we have a microcosm of a global phenomena that's taking place. And I'm so delighted that you guys show up, because if you hadn't shown up, I don't think I would make this film again, like revisiting Bharwar Predicament. It's because you had that thought and you were able to take one step back, because I'm always going through my initial enterprise, which is that to cover all the 64 castes that in my lifetime I'll make at least one stab at one representation for each caste, and I'm not even halfway there. So it was less likely to do this, but now we are doing it, and it's an entirely new film and an entirely new phenomenon. The ability to look back for anthropology in turning what was an ethnographic film into an ethno-historical circumstance, which is now what it is really, really exciting. And for me, it's very nice to have you guys here to prick me with the spear of inquiry, see where we go. And so I think that's the end of this question.
Yeah, can I ask, this may be something that we can't use, and you can refuse to answer this question if it hurts your position in any way, but I just did a kind of rough head count of the ratio of male to female cattle, and it was very clear that it's female dominated, that there's one bull to about anywhere between 15 and 25 cows in this village.
That's always been the case for the last few thousand years. The idea of you have a resident female population in herbivores. It doesn't have to be cattle, it can be antelope too. However, with cattle, there's the whole idea of bulls. The bulls are kept in a region for about 5 years, and then they're shipped out or they die. And then there's another bull. So the bulls are in fact non-territorial. They have to move across territories because the resident population has to be fertilized by another bull, another strain. Whereas that is something you'll find in pastoral populations. If you look in farming populations, despite their veneration of the cow, there are more bullocks than there are in fact cows. Now that may be slipping because of mechanization, but it's absurd that you have more. If you looked at the population of the Indian bovine cattle, you'd find more bullocks, which are castrated bulls, and less cows, which kind of goes against the veneration of the cow, but that's still because the main economic function of the agrarian enterprise was the bullock. Without the bullock, there was no traction and you couldn't actually farm. Unlike the Middle East and Arabia and Mongolia, this is not a horse country. This is a place where horses are venerated, but they're forever even, and Jhalawad is a horse breeding place. There's some places where we do breed horses, but the horses are so small in number that all through history they've always been imported from wherever. I mean, they were finally even imported by the Brits from Australia, the whalers for the Second World War cavalry, which was kind of the cavalry were dying at that time. So, did I answer the question?
Yeah. So, it looks like what you were speaking to earlier, the fact that this is not an isolated locale. People have connections, and there are bulls.
Well, you can't have cows. You can't have the same bull, because that lead to the weakening of the herd. The genetic pool would become less. Now, the strange thing is, that's also a term for the antelope. Now, you haven't seen that antelope here, but you'll see him if some people will, because I'm making a film on animal compassion. That's an antelope that's black on top and white below, and it's got these spiral horns. It's just about 10 miles from here. And it was all over the place. That was one of the signs when the Aryans came and said, well, what is our country? Wherever the black buck roams, that is Aryavat. That's the land of the Arya. And so it already told you that, and with the species of the antelope is like the Rajput boss. He has a territory, and he's forever trying to seduce females into that space. He protects his territory by keeping other males out. which is very similar to the Rajput enterprise of saying we are going to govern the territory and then have populations we seduce by taxation or other kinds of opportunity. Protection is one, and seduction of revenue is the other. Many populations come to these things because they're being persecuted by other places, and so protection and revenue are the two ways in which you kept populations that would flee as soon as you become a tyrant. You raise the taxes 2%, and they say, hell with you, I'm off to the next district because the king there is giving me, or the region or the regional authorities giving me lower taxes. So that kept the kings in check, and the petty kingdoms had to vie with each other for capital as well, and of all kinds, because as you talked about earlier, this is not a monocultural economic zone. It's not a banana republic that only produces bananas. And you know full well that those kind of specialist economic zones were created as a colonial enterprise because to supply the colonial enterprise centers with efficient products. So bananas are best grown in wherever they're grown, where they're grown, I think in Mexico, Colombia, whatever.
So do you see the Rajputs as having a continual role, if not at least a presence, in managing, even if it's just in terms of advice, the affairs of the various constituent food producers in your kingdom?
Well, I think now, this last century, without any qualification, in terms of achievement, in terms of dominance, has been a Patel century. From about 1918, with the rise of the Patel as an economic force within the kingdoms of this area, which they came about 50 years before that, they became the new power kids on the block. They were also part of the machinery that were very easily allied with the nationalist movement, whereas many of the Rajput kingdoms were retaining and holding the old order in place and were sometimes seen as to be bastions of colonial support. And so in some instances they may have been, but the general impression was that the freedom fighters came from the landed estate. And this is seen in the leaders that the nationalist movement threw up. They're Rajput leaders for sure, but they're not of the stature of Mahatma Gandhi or Sardar Patel or Nehru. All of them come from non-ruling groups like the Brahmin, the farmer Karnbi, the mercantile Gandhi. These are groups that weren't in fact ruling groups, but they became the dominant intellectual and economic forces. And if you look at all the airports and the new enterprises and the new cities, they're all named after the new emergent power. One might think that this power is perhaps now on the wane, but for the last century, the Rajputs may claim dominance and twirl their mustaches and things like that, but they have been in a subordinate defensive role. They're trying to retain their historical controls, and therefore, in a kind of strange way, families like mine who are not politically engaged or not we are not leading great enterprises of capitalism, are still useful to the local population because we are checks to the unbridled ambitions of other groups. And so we are used very strategically by these other groups, saying, this is the legitimate authority. He may be a toothless tiger, but he has served his caste, has served his family's served, and you are just rampant corrupt opportunists. So that has led to a revisioning of the place of these persons. But I think in geopolitical terms and in very straightforward political terms, the Rajput is no different than any other empowered caste. There's a historical precedence, and there are assumptions and presumptions of how people of Rajput descent would act. But they're also seen by certain forces in opposition as kind of backward because they are the old force, the old guard. And with the old guard, there's also certain ideas that they represent values and ideas that were dominant ones, but are not current or shouldn't be as current. So I think, like forces, economic forces, military forces, ecological forces, there's an ideological battle that goes on all the time. Which ideas are going to dominate? And as there's a resurgence of Indian nationalism and Indian power muscle in the global terms, many of these, like when I was little, the whole idea that kings lived in palaces was really a bad thing. But now it's a way to show Indian power. So everywhere, as you would know in Rajasthan, the government supports, and the government here supports palaces like this by saying, this is national heritage. We can compare with any country in the West by having cultural institutions. Cultural institutions is social capital, and that we have musical institutions, architectural institutions, all these things.
So you're
That
in some ways like the wild ass.
yeah, so that now we become the very same persons that were once shunned as signs of negative of negativism, undesirable conduct, are now in fact showcasing another notion, a vibrant, assertive economic positivism that comes out of the Indian middle class, who want that these palaces exist, who want to have Disney World, and who want to have these temples that are, there's such a spate of temple building, saying we are now, God's given us this new energy. So again, the ideas, like anything else, contend for space. And at this time there's this whole reversal. Bollywood makes films about princes as desirable things, and that they are the vestigial remains, that's where Indian civilization was maintained, not in the British heartland, because the British were doing away with local institutions, but because of these kingdoms, they retained Indian civilization, cultural norms, which have now gone back to flood. Classical music, painting, all these were housed in so-called colonial courts, or in colonial dominated indigenous kingdoms. And now that we are a nation and we are a free nation, the central states, which were provinces that were dominated and controlled directly by the British enterprise, are now saying, hey, wait a minute, hell with the British. This also goes in the lapse of titles. For instance, when my brother succeeded my father, one of the titles that he chose to absolve himself was he doesn't like to be called His Highness anymore, like my father's. And they didn't like it, even though they'd used the title His Highness since colonial times, 1850, because that's associated now with a title of imposition. It's a foreigner title given to you, and you much rather say, who the hell are these guys? We threw them out, we survived them. We have more ancient titles that are more resonant and more appreciative of the common person who sees us that way. And why should we use these foreign titles? Which was not the case. My grandfather, great-grandfather, they were delighted that the British, or at least they had to appear to be delighted, to receive titles from the dominant power.
You guys have any questions? I have a lot more, but I'd like to finish this tape up and do another session with you at another point with
How's the sounding?
keep going, listen.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to make sure he's paying attention.
It's okay, but there's so much stuff going on.
Yeah, like the music out there.
And the birds. and
Yeah,
stuff,
yeah.
But
Well, I mean,
I'm still
that's-
picking up your voice, but
Yeah.
I was thinking, like, when we're editing and stuff, it may.
You just have to live with that,
Yeah.
because
Okay.
also that's coming laterally, so it'll be
Yeah.
there, but it won't hurt you that.
All right.
Well, I wanted to ask.
Hi, I didn't call you at 4 in the morning. I don't know if you were here when we got that phone call from temple administrator last night. I wasn't sure because you may have been transitioning between one set of clothes to another. But she talked about a terrorism threat alert in Ahmedabad. so I didn't think it was good for you to go. And anyway, Nasir missed the plane, as I knew she would, and so the guys that were going to wait there till the evening till she comes, and I don't think you would have enjoyed staying there all day. So it luckily happened that way for you.
Well, can we use we only have 8 minutes left on this tape, but maybe just 5 minutes can respond to this about the particular characters seen in that film. You got probably to know Maya and Mayra a little bit over the course of, first of all, how long did you spend with Roger Sandall filming that, preparing for that?
Well, I mean, the whole enterprise of filming in this part began after I had gone to the Northeast, where my wife is from, where people more look like Chunmai. They're really kind of Asian-looking people, and that's where I made my first films, and I called them The Forgotten, Headhunters, and Apatani Sacrifice. So I was very much in the mold of a brown colonialist, salvage ethnography, and this was even before I picked up my first book of anthropology. So this was way back in the 70s. I had worked with Ricky Leacock and Jean Rouch and other people in the West. So I was kind of imbued with the kind of ethnographic enterprise, and I said, wow, isn't this what I should be doing? And I think to some extent that may have been tied with the lapse of my identity as a prince, and the fact that we were fighting to retain our own identity as valuable in an environment that was hostile, that said, these guys are vestigial remains of the past, they have the wrong ideology. So I said, if that's the case with us, that's also the case with tribal populations, who the national enterprise government wants you to give up your customs and become Hindu, or give up your agrarian practices of slash and burn and become more traditional ways of agriculture. All these are short-sighted imperiums established by the successor state, not knowing and not adequately understanding that the cropping patterns in tropical forests are done and consumed over hundreds of years, so that in Rocky's country, when they put 3 seeds into one hole, and that flowers at different times and fruits at different times, that's because they know in lands that are not so how shall I put it, fertile, these kinds of things happen. So I went along merrily, having learned how to do some things. If something was to go, I was going to protect it. But with that came this kind of arrogance that, I can do it, that noblesse oblige, familial, paternalism that was there. The natives don't know what they're doing, I can do it for them. All the lessons that visual anthropology understands to have been prevalent in anthropology and in the whole colonial enterprise. We are free so we can enslave others, kind of thing. So that's what I did. But when I went there, I was so insensitive. I went like this, I was younger. So they said to me in those first films, they're not in the films, but in conversations I had with them, you say you come to help us, you come to understand us, but how insensitive you are. We have no facial hair. You look like a monkey we shoot and eat for breakfast, right? And he says, okay, you respect us, but you won't eat with us because they eat the cow. And I'm saying I'm a Hindu. And they raise cattle in those hills, the special Mithun cattle, and the different sacrificial ways in which they eat it. So they say, okay, we are brothers and all. You won't eat what I'm giving you. And are you going to give me your daughter? Are you going to take my daughter? So all this is nonsense. You are not one of us. And let's not be fooled by this thing that you're coming to make things about us. So I vowed at that point that from that point I wouldn't go making uninvited into a place, because it was nothing but opportunism that I was seeing. And of course those films helped me to get to MIT and Harvard and all the rest of it. So they did my purpose for me. But then I came here and said, look, if that was a kind of rebound. I don't know my own family, I don't know my own region, why shouldn't I be doing that? At least I can speak about them with a little more. So that's what brought me here. Now how we began then was I was working with a guy at the Smithsonian, a guy called Sorensen. who was a protege of Margaret Mead. And he wasn't a very good filmmaker, but he had $500,000 a year budget. And so he knew I was friends with John Marshall and Ricky and Bruce and all that stuff. Ricky told me when I applied to MIT, he said, "What's the way? Why are you coming here? You're wasting your time. You're already a filmmaker. Why come here?" So I said, "Ricky, no, I need the letters behind my name, and I need to learn from you because it's very sweet of you to say this. But I made these 2-bit films, and there obviously I didn't have the vocabulary or the language at that time to say, as I'm speaking now, how exploitative they were, this and that, because I'm trained since that time to see and reinterpret what I was doing." So he said, "Okay, let's do it." So we went through that motion, then we went on to an education at Harvard, where Sally Moore said the same thing to me. She was a legal anthropologist and an Africanist. So when I came to her, she said, "Well, it's better you be my student, because they're famous Tambaya and Noor Yalman, who were world-renowned anthropologists of in Indic civilization. But she said, I think you need to work with me." And so, in fact, that's what I did. When it came to people here, I said, well, if I'm rebounding from the exotic far away, let me go to the familiar.
Sorry, we're out of tape and you have a visitor.